My name is Eleanor Wright, and I was 34 years old when the shape of my life still felt dependable. I was a mother first, then a daughter, and somewhere in between, the person everyone leaned on when things needed smoothing over. I believed stability was something you earned by being reasonable, by listening more than you spoke, by absorbing tension before it spread. At that time, my days revolved around routines that felt quietly meaningful. School drop-offs, late-night laundry, small conversations that stitched one week to the next. I told myself this was what balance looked like. Nothing dramatic, nothing fragile, just steady movement forward. With my parents, I occupied a familiar position I never questioned. I was the one who understood them, who translated emotions, who filled silences so no one else had to. It felt natural, almost invisible. I mistook that invisibility for trust. My sister existed on a different axis of the family, but I didn't frame it as imbalance. I framed it as difference. She needed more, I handled more. That was simply how our roles settled, like furniture no one thought to rearrange. I remember believing that if I kept things calm, everything else would remain intact, that love was proven through consistency, that showing up quietly counted as enough. Looking back, what strikes me isn't ignorance, but certainty. I truly believed this structure was solid. I didn't yet understand how easily something can appear whole, right up until the moment pressure finds its weakest seam. I had no language for fracture then, no reason to suspect the ground beneath me was already shifting. All I knew was effort, patience, and faith in patterns that had never been tested by real loss. At the time, that felt like certainty, not vulnerability at all. Yet, I grew up understanding my place long before I understood why it existed. In our family, responsibility moved in one direction and attention moved in another. I learned early that being dependable meant being quiet, and that reliability was rewarded with expectations, not care. My parents never named these roles. They didn't have to. They showed up automatically, reinforced through small moments that never seemed important enough to challenge. I was the child who adjusted plans, who waited, who filled gaps when something went missing. My sister was the one whose needs arrived first, fully formed and unquestioned. At the time, I didn't experience this as unfairness. I experienced it as normal. When praise came my way, it was usually attached to endurance. When concern surfaced, it was rarely about me. I learned how to translate that absence into pride, convincing myself that strength meant requiring less. There were moments I noticed the imbalance, but they passed quickly. I explained them away with logic. Someone had to be steady. Someone had to understand. I was good at understanding. I told myself that made me essential, not overlooked. As adults, the pattern didn't disappear. It matured. Conversations bent subtly toward my sister's dreams, her setbacks, her ambitions. I listened, I supported, I absorbed the emotional overflow so no one else had to sit with discomfort. What I didn't realize then was how much training was involved, how carefully I had been shaped to carry weight without asking who put it there. I thought love looked like accommodation, and loyalty meant silence. That belief followed me into motherhood, into grief, into places where it would finally be tested. I didn't know yet that the structure I protected so faithfully would falter the moment I needed it to hold me. It would take loss to expose how conditional that support was, how quickly the dependable one fades when she stops carrying weight, and how absence reveals truths that patience, explanation, and years of quiet cooperation were never strong enough to prevent it. The day my son died did not arrive with chaos. It arrived quietly, like something unreal slipping into the room while everyone pretended not to see it. I remember standing in the hospital hallway, noticing how ordinary everything looked, and wondering how the world could remain intact when mine had just stopped. The days that followed blurred into logistics, phone calls, paperwork, decisions I didn't feel qualified to make. Grief didn't rush me. It sat heavy and still, pressing inward. I moved through it carefully, as if any sudden motion might shatter what little composure I had left. When the funeral came, I waited for my parents the way I always had, not anxiously, automatically. I kept checking the entrance, expecting their familiar shapes to appear, certain they would walk in just before it began. They didn't. The chairs remained empty. No explanation arrived in time to fill that space. I didn't feel anger then. I felt suspended, as if my emotions were waiting for instructions that never came. People spoke to me softly, offering condolences, but all I could see was absence arranged neatly in the front row. It felt deliberate, even if it wasn't intended that way. I told myself there must be a reason, something unavoidable. I protected that belief the same way I protected everything else that mattered to me. I focused on my son, on honoring him, on holding myself together until the day was over. Later, when the room emptied and the noise faded, the quiet became unbearable. That was when the weight of their absence finally settled, not as devastation, but as a cold understanding I wasn't ready to name. They had missed the moment that mattered most, not a performance, not a milestone, a goodbye. I didn't confront them. I didn't cry to them. I folded the disappointment inward, the way I had been trained to do. I told myself grief distorts perception, that I was too close to see clearly. But something had shifted. A line I hadn't known existed had been crossed without acknowledgement. I carried that realization silently, unsure whether it was pain or clarity taking shape. All I knew was that something essential had fractured, and no amount of patience would return it to what it had been before. I kept moving forward because stopping felt dangerous, but inside, questions began forming without answers. Why absence felt louder than presence? Why love seemed conditional at its most critical moment? I didn't accuse anyone, not even myself. I only noticed how alone grief truly was, and how quickly certainty dissolves when the people you expect most choose distance. When the days after the funeral settled into something resembling routine, my grief didn't disappear. It simply turned inward. I stopped expecting comfort and started managing my own reactions, the way I always had. I told myself that everyone grieves differently, that absence didn't automatically mean indifference, that my parents' failure to show up didn't have to carry meaning. I replayed the facts obsessively, stripping them of emotion. Travel complications, miscommunication, timing. I treated their absence like a puzzle that could be solved if I just arranged the pieces correctly. If there was an explanation, then there was nothing to confront, nothing to feel. I questioned myself instead. Maybe I expected too much. Maybe grief had made me unreasonable. I reminded myself of how often I had handled things alone before, how capable I was of carrying weight quietly. I framed my pain as inconvenience, something to be managed privately so it wouldn't burden anyone else. At night, when the house was still, the doubts grew louder. I wondered if I had failed to communicate the importance of that day, if I had minimized my own loss so effectively that others followed my lead. I replayed conversations, searching for the moment where I could have been clearer, more direct, more deserving. There was a strange comfort in blaming myself. It gave me control. If the fracture existed because of something I did or didn't do, then it was fixable. I could adjust. I could try harder. I could remain the reasonable one. But grief has a way of exhausting performance. Over time, the explanations stopped working. The logic felt thin. I noticed how carefully I protected everyone else's feelings while my own went unattended. How quickly I defended people who hadn't defended me. How natural it felt to erase my needs from the narrative. What unsettled me most wasn't the sadness. It was the realization that this pattern predated the loss.
My son's death hadn't created the imbalance, it had exposed it. The silence I maintained wasn't strength, it was conditioning.
What unsettled me wasn't the request itself, but the timing, the ease, the assumption that loss had already been processed enough to be useful. I became aware of how quickly my role had shifted from grieving. I didn't arrive at this understanding with anger. It came quietly, through repetition, through the fatigue of self-erasure. The questions shifted. Not why they weren't there, but why I worked so hard to make that absence acceptable. Grief stopped being something I explained away and became something I observed. In that distance, clarity began to form. Not sharp, not final, but steady. I could feel the ground changing beneath my feet, and for the first time, I didn't rush to stabilize it. I let the discomfort stay. I let the truth remain unfinished. That was the beginning of something different, though I couldn't yet name what direction it would take. Only that the old explanations no longer fit, and silence was starting to speak more honestly than reassurance ever had. I sensed that patience was no longer protection, but delay, and that clarity, once noticed, would keep widening until I either stepped forward or remained permanently folded inward, alone. The first time the trust was mentioned, it wasn't framed as a request. It surfaced casually, folded into conversation as if it belonged there, as if my son's absence had already been absorbed into normal life. I remember listening carefully, waiting for the moment when someone would acknowledge the weight of what they were asking. That moment never came. They spoke about the money with a practical tone, one I recognized well: responsible, forward-looking, necessary. The figure sounded unreal in the air, detached from the reason it existed. I felt myself go quiet, not out of shock, but out of recognition. This was how important things were handled in my family: gently, indirectly, without emotion interfering. No one said my son's name. No one referenced why the trust had been created in the first place. It was treated like an available resource, not a remnant of loss. I noticed how smoothly the conversation moved past grief, how efficiently it arrived at purpose. I didn't interrupt. I didn't correct the framing. I sat there, absorbing the implication that value could be reassigned so easily, that what had been meant to protect my child's future could now be redirected without ceremony. The silence I offered wasn't consent, but it sounded enough like it. My parents spoke about my sister's music career with a careful optimism, outlining possibilities, investments, timelines. They were attentive in a way I hadn't experienced around my grief. I watched them lean forward, energized by potential, animated by plans that extended beyond the discomfort of loss. I noticed something shift inside me then. Not anger, alignment, a quiet understanding that grief and ambition occupied separate spaces here, and only one of them was allowed to shape decisions. I realized that my pain was expected to remain background noise, manageable, invisible, while opportunity demanded engagement. I told myself this conversation wasn't personal, that finances complicate everything, that emotions distort judgment. I reached for explanations automatically, trying to soften the edges of what felt wrong. But the explanations didn't land the way they used to. They hovered, unconvincing. I didn't argue. I didn't say yes. I allowed the conversation to end without resolution, letting the quiet stretch between us. Inside, something hardened into focus. I could feel pressure beginning to form, not from raised voices or demands, but from expectation, from the unspoken belief that I would eventually comply, because that was who I had always been. I left that conversation carrying more than grief. I carried the understanding that my family measured value differently, and that my silence was being mistaken for availability, a misunderstanding that would soon require a response, whether spoken or withheld.
I sensed then that pressure does not announce itself loudly. It accumulates through familiarity, through assumptions left unchallenged, through histories that teach others what they are entitled to expect from you, especially when you have proven, over years of quiet endurance, that you will carry discomfort without protest. I didn't yet know how heavy that expectation would become, only that it was settling in slowly. Pressure didn't arrive all at once. It crept in through repetition, through follow-up calls that sounded polite, through messages framed as concern. My parents never demanded. They reminded. They checked in. They asked how I was doing, then gently returned to the subject, as if it were unfinished business waiting patiently on the table. My sister never asked directly either. She didn't need to. Her presence in the conversation carried expectation on its own. She spoke about her plans, her setbacks, her belief that this opportunity could change everything. She spoke as though the path ahead had already been agreed upon, and my role was simply to catch up.
I listened, I nodded, I stayed neutral. Silence had always been my most reliable tool, and I reached for it automatically. I told myself I needed time, that grief required space, that clarity would arrive if I didn't rush it. What I didn't say aloud was that every conversation felt heavier than the last. The pressure wasn't loud, it was cumulative. Each reminder stacked neatly on top of the one before it. Each assumption reinforced the belief that my hesitation was temporary, not a boundary. I noticed how often my parents spoke about fairness while ignoring context, how easily my son's absence was treated as settled, resolved enough to be moved past. I started measuring my responses carefully, editing myself in real time. I avoided words that might sound like refusal. I softened everything. I absorbed the discomfort so no one else would have to adjust their expectations. Old instincts guided me. Keep things calm. Don't escalate. Don't disappoint. Over time, confusion gave way to exhaustion. It became harder to maintain neutrality when every interaction required restraint. I felt myself shrinking during conversations, conserving energy, choosing silence because it demanded less explanation than honesty. I watched my parents grow impatient in subtle ways. Their tone shifted, barely perceptible but familiar. Concern turned into urgency. Understanding edged toward entitlement. They spoke as though the decision already existed and was merely delayed by my emotional state. I didn't correct them. I observed the pattern repeating itself with new stakes. The dependable one would eventually comply. That was the precedent I had set. What surprised me was the absence of anger. I didn't feel wronged so much as seen clearly for the first time. The pressure clarified something that grief alone had not. My value here was tied to my willingness to yield, not to my loss. That realization didn't arrive dramatically. It settled slowly, with a strange calm. I understood then that my silence was being interpreted as negotiation, not hesitation. And for the first time, I recognized that continuing to say nothing would still be a choice, one that carried consequences of its own. I didn't announce this understanding to anyone. I kept showing up, kept listening, kept responding with measured pauses. But internally, something had disengaged. I stopped trying to shape outcomes. I stopped rehearsing explanations that would make my refusal easier for others to accept. I noticed how often my parents spoke about unity while applying pressure unevenly, how my sister interpreted my silence as progress rather than resistance. The more they leaned in, the clearer the structure became. My grief was inconvenient because it interrupted momentum. Their persistence wasn't cruelty, it was consistency. They were following a pattern that had always worked. What changed was my awareness of it. I began to see that saying nothing was not neutral. It was being read, translated, and used. My quiet had weight, and everyone else was deciding how to spend it. That realization drained the last of my confusion. What remained wasn't defiance or resentment.
It was clarity, steady and unemotional, settling into place as I recognized that I was being positioned, not supported, and that understanding would eventually require a response. That truth waited quietly, unavoidable, and no longer negotiable. There was a moment when I realized that every explanation I offered only made things easier for everyone else. Each sentence I softened, each justification I rehearsed, reassured them that the imbalance could continue without consequence. I wasn't being heard, I was being managed. I noticed how quickly conversations reset after I spoke, how my words were absorbed, reinterpreted, and used to support outcomes I hadn't agreed to. Explaining myself didn't create understanding, it created permission, and I was the one supplying it. So I stopped. Not abruptly, not visibly. I didn't announce a boundary or correct their assumptions. I simply withdrew from the role of translator. I answered less, I clarified nothing. I allowed pauses to stretch without filling them. At first, the silence felt uncomfortable, almost irresponsible. I had been trained to keep things moving, to smooth tension before it hardened. Doing nothing felt like neglecting a duty I had always performed without being asked. But something shifted as I held that silence. Without my explanations, their certainty began to wobble. They filled the gaps themselves, projecting intentions, inventing timelines, reassuring one another that everything was still on track. I watched without correcting them. This wasn't avoidance, it was restraint. I realized that I didn't owe clarity to people who used it to pressure me. I didn't owe reassurance to expectations I hadn't consented to. Withholding explanation became the only way to stop participating in the imbalance. I stayed calm. I stayed polite. Outwardly, nothing changed enough to be challenged. Inwardly, I was no longer negotiating. I wasn't preparing them for disappointment. I wasn't managing their reactions in advance. The relief surprised me. Silence required less effort than performance. It created space where my grief could exist without being repurposed. I felt distance form, not as punishment, but as protection. I understood then that power didn't shift through confrontation. It shifted when I stopped making myself accessible to pressure. By stepping back quietly, I allowed consequences to unfold without my intervention. Whatever happened next would no longer pass through me first. I didn't feel brave and I didn't feel cold. I felt precise. For the first time, my responses were aligned with my reality instead of their expectations. I began to understand that distance could be an act of honesty, not abandonment. By refusing to explain myself into exhaustion, I reclaimed something quiet but essential. I wasn't withdrawing love, I was withdrawing access. And in that distinction, I sensed the story beginning to move beyond me. The weight I had carried so carefully was no longer centered on my choices. It shifted outward, toward those who believed my silence was temporary. I didn't correct that belief, I let it stand. Because whatever unfolded next needed to do so without my mediation, without my emotional labor smoothing its edges. Only then would the consequences reveal themselves clearly. I waited, trusting that truth does not rush, and that imbalance exposed eventually rearranges itself without guidance from those it once favored. When I didn't respond the way they expected, things didn't explode, they thinned. Conversations became shorter, check-ins became irregular. The urgency that had once pressed gently but persistently against me began to redirect itself elsewhere. I heard about the fallout indirectly, small comments, passing remarks, details shared without intention. My parents sounded unsettled, unsure how to proceed without the cooperation they assumed would arrive. Plans stalled, timelines blurred. The confidence that had animated earlier conversations quietly drained away. My sister struggled in ways I had never been invited to witness before, not dramatically, not publicly, but practically. Doors that were supposed to open stayed closed. Support she relied on became conditional, fragmented. I noticed how quickly enthusiasm turned into frustration when certainty disappeared. I remained distant, not out of strategy, but necessity. I didn't insert myself to stabilize anything. I didn't offer solutions or reassurance. I let the discomfort exist without translation. This was new for all of us. What surprised me was how quickly the dynamic shifted once I stopped carrying it. Without my silence smoothing edges, tensions surfaced naturally. My parents grew impatient with uncertainty. My sister grew resentful of delays. None of it required my involvement to become visible. There was no satisfaction in watching this unfold. I didn't feel vindicated or relieved. I felt removed. The emotional labor I had once provided was no longer available, and without it, the structure revealed its fragility. Occasionally, someone would reach out, testing the distance. A neutral question, a vague update. I responded politely, briefly, without reopening space. The boundary wasn't spoken, it was maintained. I noticed how the absence of my participation altered their behavior more than any argument could have. Expectations adjusted slowly, reluctantly. The assumption of access weakened. I was aware of the shift, but I didn't name it aloud. Naming would have invited discussion, negotiation, correction. Distance worked because it stayed undefined. It allowed everyone to adjust privately without forcing me back into explanation. That quiet adjustment mattered more than any apology could have. I needed space that did not require translation or permission from anyone else at all. What unfolded next didn't feel like revenge. It felt like consequence. Not inflicted, not orchestrated, just allowed. By giving nothing, I had stopped preventing outcomes that were never mine to manage.
The story continued without my guidance, and for the first time, that felt appropriate. I wasn't at the center of the tension anymore. I wasn't buffering impact or redistributing weight. The distance held, quiet and firm, preparing me for a kind of resolution that didn't depend on confrontation, only on staying where I was. When I stepped back far enough, the quiet surprised me. It wasn't empty or tense the way I had always imagined distance would feel. It was steady. Without constant updates, explanations, or emotional calibration, my days began to settle into a rhythm that belonged to me again. Grief changed in that space. Without being negotiated or postponed, it surfaced honestly. Some days it was heavy, other days distant, but it no longer had to justify itself. I wasn't preparing anyone for my sadness or softening it to keep conversations comfortable. I let it exist without translation. I noticed how much energy obligation had consumed before. The careful listening, the anticipatory guilt, the sense that I owed availability simply because I had always provided it. That weight lifted gradually, not all at once, but enough for me to breathe without effort. My parents remained present in a limited way, polite, measured. We spoke occasionally, but without expectation beneath the words. My sister stayed distant. There were no confrontations, no resolutions, just space where assumptions used to be. It wasn't reconciliation, but it was honest. I didn't feel detached from them so much as unentangled. Their emotions were no longer mine to process first. I wasn't monitoring reactions or planning responses. The absence of that responsibility created a calm I hadn't known was possible. What surprised me most was how clarity didn't require closure. I didn't need acknowledgement or apology to understand where I stood. Distance provided its own answers. It showed me which connections relied on my effort to function and which ones adjusted without me. Peace arrived quietly, not as relief, not as triumph, but as alignment. My internal reality finally matched my external behavior. I wasn't explaining myself into acceptance or shrinking to preserve harmony. I was simply present where I was, without obligation pulling me elsewhere. The story didn't end cleanly. Relationships remained unresolved, suspended in a form that made sense only because it reflected the truth. That was enough. I didn't need everything to be repaired. I needed it to be real, and permanently mine alone now. I used to believe love revealed itself through patience, through endurance, through the willingness to stay reasonable when others were not.
I mistook emotional restraint for virtue and silence for maturity, never questioning who benefited most from my calm. What I understand now is simpler and harder to accept. Love that depends on my compliance is not love that can hold me. It is an arrangement, a structure that rewards availability and punishes absence, even when absence is necessary for survival. I learned that silence is not weakness, but it is not neutral either. It can be shaped into a tool, used either to erase oneself or to step out of reach. The difference lies in intention. When I stopped using silence to protect others, it began protecting me. Control does not always look like dominance. Sometimes it looks like expectation so familiar it goes unnoticed. It looks like being trusted to absorb discomfort indefinitely. I carried that role for years, believing it made me essential. In truth, it made me convenient.
There was no moment of forgiveness, no conversation that repaired what had been revealed. I didn't need one. Understanding replaced the need for resolution. I no longer search for proof of love in places that require me to disappear. What remains now is quiet. Not the heavy quiet of avoidance, but the open kind that allows grief and peace to exist together. I still miss my son. That loss does not lessen, but it no longer competes with other people's demands for space. I didn't win anything by stepping back. I simply stopped losing myself. The cost of always being reasonable was higher than I admitted for a long time. Accepting that truth did not make me bitter. It made me free enough to choose where my energy belongs. This story doesn't end with justice or reconciliation. It ends with clarity. I carry the understanding that love without presence is empty, and that control dissolves once you stop offering yourself as its foundation, quietly, steadily, without negotiation now.